In the earliest ages of Earth, long before continents carried forests or even humble carpets of moss, the surface of the planet was a restless, steaming mosaic of newborn crust. Volcanoes stitched and restitched the land with flows of molten minerals, and the air above simmered with vapor left behind from Earth's own cooling breath. Into this world, water arrived slowly, first as a haze, then as curtains of rain, and finally as a persistent, planet-shaping force. It fell with no intention other than obeying the laws of physics, though to an outside observer, it might have looked as if rain were searching for an identity, trying out different behaviors until it found the one that sculpted landscapes. Before we drift into the quiet evolution of estuaries and river mouths, take a gentle moment to like and subscribe to the Late Night Scientist channel, and let me know in the comments when and where you're listening, so this peaceful science can reach more sleepy minds ready to rest. This rain coursed across raw stone, seeking the lowest places with the eagerness of a substance discovering gravity for the first time. With every drop that landed, tiny fractions of minerals dissolved and drifted away, as if the ground were reluctantly shedding its outermost layers. The first trickles joined into threads, then grew into infant rivers, awkward experimental flows that had not yet carved channels or decided on permanent paths. They wandered over the uneven crust, snaking, splitting, merging, and occasionally evaporating mid-journey, like travelers who forgot where they were going. Where these early rivers reached the sea, if one can call those early oceans seas with a straight face, they did so without ceremony. The boundary between land and water was unstable, constantly shifting as tectonic plates heaved upward or slid downward. River mouths dissolved as quickly as they formed. One day, a flow might reach a steep cliff and tumble dramatically into the ocean. The next, a volcanic eruption would bury the entire coastline under a fresh layer of basalt, forcing the river to find a new path over the still warm rock. These first estuary-like zones existed for moments, then surrendered to geology's impatience. Yet within all this chaos, patterns began to take shape. Even the most primitive of landscapes cannot resist the steady insistence of running water. The rivers, such as they were, began to carve channels just deep enough to persist through shorter periods of crustal upheaval. The walls they etched were rough, jagged, and unstable, but they marked a beginning, a hint that Earth was gradually shifting from a molten improvisation to something that could support repeating structures. Though calling these channels geological confidence would be generous, they were at least the result of repeated attempts. The ocean, for its part, did not behave with the serene blue predictability we know today. It roiled with dissolved metals, volcanic gases, and hydrothermal inputs from a world still cooling from its formation. When rivers reached these waters, the mixing zone was not yet the gentle gradient of salinity that would later define estuaries. Instead, chemical reactions flashed unpredictably, precipitating minerals in wisps and clouds, creating momentary plumes and ribbons of color. To ancient Earth, this was not a failure of organization. It was simply chemistry in a world too young for subtlety. Still, even in its infancy, the meeting of fresh and salt water created small, fleeting microenvironments. Although devoid of plants, animals, or even complex microbes, these zones represented some of the earliest examples of gradients, places where differences in chemistry, temperature, and pH created potential. Nature loves gradients. They are opportunities waiting to be exploited, even if no organism had appeared yet to take advantage of them. Evolution, still an unspoken concept at this time, was patiently waiting in the wings. Meanwhile, the atmosphere above was gradually shifting from a suffocating blend of gases towards something capable of supporting more stable surface processes. Weather patterns began to develop, shallow though they were, and storms circled the globe in loose, uncoordinated swirls. Rain fell in fits and starts, at times drenching entire regions for centuries, then disappearing for equally long stretches. The rivers responded accordingly, swelling into torrents or shrinking to mineral-encrusted threads. Through all this inconsistency, one thing remained dependable: gravity pulling water downhill, shaping earth grain by reluctant grain. With every cycle of rainfall and runoff, the land's roughness softened, channels deepened, valleys began to form, rudimentary outlines that hinted at the continents we would eventually recognize. Though tectonics remained the loudest and most dramatic reshaper of geography, water introduced persistence, a kind of quiet repetition that began erasing the sharpest corners of the world. The first consistent river systems emerged not through intention, but inevitability. And so, in this early chapter of Earth's story, the first river mouths took shape, not as destinations, but as temporary conclusions to long and meandering experiments. They were places where land released its minerals to the sea, where stone reluctantly surrendered to fluid, and where the young planet learned, drop by drop, how to coordinate its own surface. Nothing yet lived here. Nothing yet thrived here. But the stage was forming, carved gradually by water that asked for nothing and changed everything. In the end, these early river-sea encounters were not elegant or efficient. They were hesitant, messy, and short-lived. But in their unpredictability lay the foundation for every estuary, delta, and tidal marsh that would one day teem with life. For now, Earth was simply practicing, experimenting without a manual, hoping perhaps that repetition would eventually resemble wisdom. By the late Proterozoic, Earth had grown noticeably more patient with itself. The wild volatility of earlier ages was calming. Tectonic plates still wandered, but they did so with a sense of deliberation rather than the frantic shuffling of a newborn planet. The atmosphere had changed too, less suffocating, less impulsive. With this new stability came a quiet transformation along the edges of continents. Rivers began to carry more than just flowing water. They carried the stories of the landscapes behind them, ground down into particles so small that each one could have been mistaken for a thought. Sediment was, in some ways, the planet's first form of long-distance communication. Pebbles broke into sand, sand broke into silt, and silt slid into clay. Each reduction a step toward becoming something rivers could lift, carry, and release far from its birthplace. For millions of years, Erosion had been happening in the background, an unassuming process of rocks becoming smaller rocks. But now, those smaller rocks mattered. They accumulated. They behaved. They began to shape river mouths with a gentle but persistent hand. At first, sediment didn't linger. It scattered across coastlines like reluctant travelers stepping off a boat, unsure whether to stay or immediately return home. Waves redistributed the grains, tides brushed them aside, and storms occasionally scooped them back into deeper waters. But sediment is patient, even by geological standards. As rivers wore down continental interiors, they delivered increased amounts of material, tiny minerals, microscopic fragments, grains no thicker than a memory's echo to the same coastal zones again and again. What began as accidental gatherings eventually became accumulations too substantial to ignore. Gradually, the coastline transformed from a sharp meeting of land and sea into something softer, more layered. No longer was the river mouth just a narrow opening where fresh water fell into salt like a hurried commuter. Instead, fans of sediment spread outward, forming gentle slopes, shallow shelves, and faintly branching patterns. It was the earliest hint of structure, an unintentional architectural gesture formed by nothing more than the physics of slowing water. Rivers, having spent their early lives carving downward and forward, now expanded sideways. As the flow speed decreased upon reaching the sea, the heaviest particles fell first, forming coarse beds. Finer grains floated farther before settling in delicate layers, each one a whisper of the river's former journey. These thin sheets stacked themselves patiently, building up soft foundations that reshaped coastlines without needing anyone's approval. Sediment had discovered stability, something it previously treated like an optional suggestion. As deltas began to form, they were clumsy and inconsistent, often undone by storms, by glacial pulses, or by the occasional tectonic tantrum. Yet these early proto-deltas persisted in spirit. Every time nature wiped one away, another slowly formed in its place. They were not yet the lush branching networks we might picture in later ages, but they were unmistakable signs of rivers learning to slow down just enough to leave a mark. Chemistry joined in quietly, as chemistry often does. The increased presence of dissolved nutrients in river water led to subtle interactions with minerals at the coastline. Flocculation, particles clumping together like shy acquaintances realizing they have things in common, encouraged even more sediment to settle. These microscopic unions helped stabilize the muddy beginnings of what would someday be considered true estuarine substrates. Though invisible at the time, this increased cohesiveness was a turning point. Sediment was no longer simply passing through. It was putting down roots, metaphorically speaking. Meanwhile, the continents themselves were changing shape and character. Weathering intensified as oxygen levels rose and temperatures fluctuated more gently. Rocks exposed at the surface broke down under chemical assault, feeding rivers a richer assortment of particles than before. Granite, basalt, sandstone. Each contributed its own texture to the evolving coastal palette. The sediment load increased. not dramatically enough to impress a casual observer, but enough to shift the balance at river mouths millions of years at a time. And with more sediment came more complexity. Channels began to split and rejoin, forming small braided systems at their termini. Water, slowed by its own cargo, fanned out into quieter zones where grains settled in soft shoals. These areas were not yet stable enough for ecosystems to take hold, but they represented the first persistent coastal structures the planet had ever seen. Shallow places that might last for thousands of years instead of mere decades. It was in these tentative, muddy expansions that the seeds of future estuaries were planted. The world did not know it yet. There was still no life large enough to notice, let alone appreciate it. But sediment was beginning one of the most influential collaborations in Earth's history. By lingering, it invited new forms of hydrology. By accumulating, it encouraged coastlines to develop contours. By discovering the virtues of staying put, it allowed the planet's edges to experiment with shapes they had never attempted before. And all of this happened without intention. Sediment wasn't trying to engineer habitats or sculpt landscapes. It simply followed the rules of momentum and friction, of density and flow. Yet from these rules emerged patterns, persistent ones, expressive ones. Nature has a habit of stumbling into brilliance, and here, in these slow-building coastal shelves, was one of its earliest successes. Looking back, it's almost charming. Sediment, once a restless traveler, finally settling down and reshaping the world simply by refusing to keep moving. Commitment, it turns out, can be surprisingly powerful, especially when practiced for several 100 million years. By the time the Great Oxidation event settled into its long aftermath, Earth had undergone a transformation so profound that even the rocks seemed to breathe differently. Oxygen, once an insignificant trace gas, had grown bold. It drifted through the atmosphere with the confidence of a newcomer who discovers the party has no dress code. And with its arrival, the chemistry of the world shifted quietly but completely, especially in places where rivers met the sea. River mouths, once mere deposits of minerals and momentum, suddenly found themselves in the midst of a subtle revolution. Oxygen did what oxygen always does. It reacted. It embraced metals with eager enthusiasm, forming oxides with such speed that iron, once abundantly dissolved in oceans, began to fall out of the water in rusty curtains. The seas, once cloudy with dissolved minerals, began to clear. The reddish precipitation of iron settled onto the seafloor in banded layers that would someday tell stories to geologists. Though for the moment, no one existed to read those stories except the rocks themselves. At the river mouths, these changes were particularly dramatic. Fresh water carried minerals that behaved entirely differently in the presence of oxygen. Elements that once traveled invisibly now formed visible particles, drifting, clumping, and settling like new residents unsure of where to put their belongings. Subtle gradients emerged, not just of salinity, but of oxidation state, pH, and chemical potential. These boundaries acted as silent negotiators, parsing the mineral conversations between land and sea. Rivers, for their part, began delivering a different kind of cargo. with oxygen permeating the atmosphere and surface waters. Weathering on land intensified. Rocks that previously crumbled slowly now reacted enthusiastically with air and rain. New minerals formed, dissolved, and reformed in patterns that depended heavily on oxygen's presence. The rivers drew these altered materials toward the coast, carrying with them traces of a landscape adjusting to its oxygen-rich circumstances. At the coastline, the mixing of river water and seawater created chemical environments that flickered with reactions. Ions switched partners. Molecules rearranged themselves. Minerals that had once been content to stay dissolved now found themselves impressed into forming solids. River mouths became crucibles in which Earth tested new chemistries, some promising, some fleeting. Though the world remained devoid of complex life, these shifting chemistries set the foundation for future ecological possibilities. For the first time, the coastline became something more than a boundary. It became a filter. Fresh water, loaded with altered minerals, met oxygenated seawater and underwent transformations that changed what ultimately reached the open ocean. Nutrients were trapped or released, depending on their chemical affinities. Particles aggregated and fell, forming soft, oxygen-tinted muds that lined the coastal shallows. Even without biological assistance, these zones began performing a function that would one day define estuaries, modifying what the river brought before passing it along. To the ocean, this was a startling development. It had grown accustomed to accepting river inputs uncritically, taking whatever minerals arrived and distributing them across its vast depths. But with oxygen involved, river mouths sent different messages. Some substances that had once fed marine chemistry vanished before arrival. Others appeared unexpectedly, newly formed by the reactions upstream. The ocean, though incapable of surprise, would have experienced something close to it if it had been able. Meanwhile, the atmosphere continued evolving. Oxygen did not rise uniformly or consistently. It fluctuated like a window opened too far, then nudged back into place. These shifts altered the balance between weathering on land and deposition at river mouths. Some periods encouraged rapid oxidation of surface minerals, while others slowed the process, creating long rhythms of sediment delivery that shaped the chemical character of coastal zones. It was a kind of slow, planet-wide breathing, one that pushed oxygen into new spaces and pulled reactions into equilibrium. In these chemically active transition zones, shallow waters became dynamic laboratories. The clarity of seawater increased as iron precipitated out, allowing sunlight to penetrate deeper than ever before. Though complex photosynthesizers had not yet claimed these spaces, the increased light availability began influencing microbial communities offshore. River mouths, unintentionally, were helping illuminate the ocean. One of the most striking changes occurred within the sediments themselves. As oxygen penetrated the upper layers of coastal mud, new minerals crystallized. Oxides, hydroxides, and mixed compounds that would have been impossible before this atmospheric shift. These minerals formed colorful streaks and nodules, recording the gradual oxidation of the planet with the patience only geology possesses. Each grain that settled told part of a chemical transition, the planet learning to incorporate oxygen into its very skin. This chemically altered mud behaved differently than earlier sediments. It trapped certain elements more effectively, sequestering them within the coastal floor for long stretches of time. Other elements became more mobile, dissolving readily and drifting farther out to sea. River mouths, therefore, began influencing not just geology, but the long-term distribution of nutrients, an effect that would matter immensely once life diversified. In truth, these early estuary-like zones were not yet habitats. They lacked plants, animals, and the bustling microbial diversity that would one day crowd their waters. But they were preparing the stage. They were stabilizing. They were learning how to moderate extremes. They were discovering, through nothing more than physics reshaped by chemistry, how to become reliable ecological translators. And as oxygen continued to flow into the atmosphere, like a house finally cracking open a window after ages of stale air, the world breathed deeper. The coastlines shimmered with reactions no eye could witness. River mouths, once passive endpoints, became active participants in Earth's evolving chemistry. No life watched, no life cared. But these zones were quietly becoming ready for guests. By the dawn of the early Paleozoic, Earth's coastlines had matured into restless yet recognizable landscapes. Shallow seas washed gently, or sometimes not so gently, against sediment-softened shores. Rivers meandered across continental margins before spilling into coastal waters. Their mouths alternately widened or redirected by tides, storms, and the stubborn physics of flowing water. In these zones of persistent instability, life made an unexpected decision. It moved in. Microbes, in their timeless practicality, were always searching for new places to anchor their existence. They did not seek comfort, for comfort had never been an option in their long evolutionary history. Instead, they sought opportunity, or at least the absence of strong objections. River mouths offered exactly that. The conditions were chaotic, but not hostile enough to forbid occupation. The gradients of temperature, chemistry, and salinity fluctuated wildly. The currents shifted with little warning. Sediments accumulated unpredictably. And yet, for microbes accustomed to improvisation, this was simply another unclaimed niche. Microbial mats, thin, layered carpets of cooperative microorganisms, began to establish themselves in the shallows, where fresh water mingled with early ocean water. These mats had no grand plan. They adhered to whatever surfaces they could: soft sediment, small stones, or each other. They wove themselves into cohesive sheets, each layer performing its part. Photosynthesizers near the surface absorbed sunlight. Chemotrophs deeper down manipulated minerals. Anaerobes at the base survived quite happily in the oxygen-poor layers where few other organisms dared to linger. Together, they formed miniature ecosystems within a few millimeters of thickness. The river mouths did not make this easy. Every shift in current threatened to peel the mats from their foundations. Swirling eddies lifted edges of microbial carpets, only for them to flop back down like soggy parchment. Sudden storms sent sediment-rich water cascading over the mats, burying some layers and exposing others. But microbial life had long mastered the art of persistence. When buried, it continued working in the dark. When exposed, it basked and rebuilt. The instability that kept larger organisms away simply became another condition to endure. Salinity, that fickle architect of biological boundaries, fluctuated on a daily rhythm. High tides brought salty surges into the shallows, diluting the freshwater flow. Low tides allowed rivers to reclaim the space, temporarily freshening the waters. Microbial mats adapted in place. Some species tolerated the salt swings with stoic indifference. Others shifted their metabolic strategies. A few simply endured the less than ideal intervals until the environment returned to something tolerable. It was not an elegant strategy, but it worked. Evolution often rewards the organisms that are willing to shrug and stay put. The mats brought something new to these river mouths: stability. Their tissues, though microscopic, helped bind sediments. Grains of sand and silt adhered to sticky microbial surfaces, gradually giving rise to firmer substrates. In time, this helped create patches of consolidated ground that resisted erosion, allowing the mats to expand further. The microbes were not consciously engineering their environment, but their presence had consequences. They were accidental architects, shaping the very terrain that supported them. Meanwhile, the river mouths offered protection from many early predators. The Paleozoic seas, while still young in complexity, already hosted creatures inclined to graze on microbial communities. But the river-sea transition zones bewildered these would-be predators. The sediments were too soft, the currents too unpredictable, the salinity too unreliable. Many stayed in deeper, more stable waters, leaving the microbial mats to thrive in relative peace. Life, in its quiet wisdom, had once again discovered that choosing the least desirable neighborhood can sometimes be an excellent survival strategy. Chemical gradients added another layer of intrigue. As river water flowed over the mats, it delivered different minerals than the ocean provided. The microbes responded by diversifying their metabolisms, exploiting whichever elements became available at any given moment. Some used iron, others manipulated sulfur. A few performed metabolic contortions that would impress even modern biochemists. These differences allowed mats to form zoned structures, patchwork mosaics of microbial functions stitched together by necessity rather than design. As the mats thickened and expanded, they altered the chemistry of their surroundings. They oxygenated their own microenvironments while simultaneously creating anaerobic pockets beneath them. They trapped fine sediments, clarifying the water around them. They changed how nutrients cycled. These effects were small at first, but persistent. Over millions of years, they helped transform river mouths from chemically reactive zones into biologically reactive ones, places where life influenced water as much as water influenced life. The mats also left traces in the sedimentary record. Their surfaces resisted erosion long enough for ripples and impressions to form, preserving fleeting interactions between mud, water, and microbial communities. Long after the mats themselves decayed, their signatures remained, marking the earliest examples of life-modifying coastal landscapes. These impressions hinted at a new chapter in Earth's history. the age in which biology would begin collaborating with geology, creating forms far more intricate than either could manage alone. The river mouths did not celebrate this shift. They simply continued being chaotic, as river mouths are inclined to do. But now they carried life, not as passengers, but as partners. The microbes had transformed a space no one else wanted into a foothold of innovation. They had stabilized sediments, exploited gradients, and turned turbulence into opportunity. They were pioneers of brackish living, long before brackish meant anything to the world. Evolution had, quite unintentionally, chosen one of the most confusing environments on Earth as its new workshop. And in this overlooked corner of the early Paleozoic, life began its slow, persistent expansion into the spaces between land and sea. By the Silurian, Earth was discovering color. Greens spread slowly across the once barren continents as early land plants emerged, fragile at first, then increasingly confident. These were not forests in any modern sense, just low mats of mossy pioneers and simple vascular plants that stood only a little taller than their ambitions. But their arrival marked a turning point for river mouths. For the first time, the land itself began to hold together, clinging to its own edges with quiet determination. Plants approached the water's edge cautiously, as though wary of overstaying their welcome. They rooted in damp soils along riverbanks where moisture was dependable and competition minimal. Their thin stems and simple leaves caught sunlight efficiently, powering growth that pushed them outward and downward at the same time. Wherever roots appeared, the loose sediments that had so freely drifted toward the sea began to pause. Soil held itself in place with a newfound sense of belonging, no longer eager to rush downstream at the first hint of rain. With erosion slowed, rivers changed personality. Channels stabilized. Banks became gentler and less prone to collapse. As rivers flowed toward the coast, they carried finer sediments than before. Their coarser loads trapped upstream by the stubborn grip of roots. This altered the very shape of river mouths. They widened as sediment fan-out increased, but the expansion was softer, more deliberate. Instead of chaotic slurries of material tumbling into coastal shallows, the deposition patterns became more consistent. Water lingered, slowing slightly as it approached the sea, creating broader transitional zones where fresh water and salt water could mingle without immediate disruption. These transitions were subtle but revolutionary. For millions of years, river mouths had been fleeting geographical events, temporary meetings of water types that shifted with every storm and seasonal flood. Now, thanks to terrestrial vegetation, the river mouths began to develop continuity. Their forms repeated themselves long enough to be recognizable. Estuary-like environments emerged as stable shapes, not accidents. It was the beginning of a new kind of coastal geography, one influenced as much by plants as by geology. The earliest vascular plants, with their modest height and simple branching, sent roots into the soil with surprising effectiveness. These roots created miniature networks of support that thickened the banks and dampened the effects of floods. Even when storms swept through, the plants clung stubbornly, their intertwined structures absorbing force like natural shock absorbers. In doing so, they prevented the wholesale mobilization of sediments that had defined river mouths for hundreds of millions of years. As plants crept closer to the coast, their influence deepened. They did not intentionally broaden river mouths. They simply existed as obstacles to erosion. But their presence allowed sediments to settle in places where they previously would have vanished. Each patch of vegetation effectively sponsored the creation of a tiny terrace, a platform for additional sediment accumulation. Over time, these terraces stacked, merged, and extended, creating low, sprawling plains that stretched toward the sea. Water flowed over these new surfaces with reduced urgency, allowing the mixing zones between land and ocean to expand into true spaces rather than thin, shifting boundaries. These plant-stabilized coastlines provided a new suite of microhabitats. Shallow pools formed behind natural barriers of vegetation. Narrow channels threaded between plant clusters. Mudflats settled into shapes sculpted by gentle currents rather than violent floods. Each feature represented a new way for water, sediment, and sunlight to interact. The coastline had become an architect with a broader toolset, and the results were unmistakably more refined. As the Devonian approached, plants grew taller and more structurally complex. Some developed woody tissues, which gave them greater mechanical strength and allowed them to colonize increasingly diverse terrains. Their expanding root systems stabilized not only riverbanks, but entire floodplains. Forests, still modest but undeniable, rose inland and increased the supply of organic material washing toward the coast. When plant debris accumulated near river mouths, it altered water flow in ways that encouraged the formation of new channels and shaded pockets where sediments could settle undisturbed. With all this newfound stability, estuarine areas developed a sense of endurance. Water no longer swept through in abrupt, erasing motions. Instead, tidal rhythms sculpted the soft edges of river mouths, establishing patterns that persisted across seasons and even geological intervals. Freshwater and saltwater engaged in slower, more predictable exchanges, creating environments rich with chemical gradients and opportunities for future life to explore. Roots did all of this without seeking acknowledgement. They were simply doing what roots do, anchoring, absorbing, and exploring the ground around them. Yet their collective influence amounted to large-scale engineering, reshaping landscapes thousands of kilometers long. If modern humans had carried out such a transformation, we might call it infrastructure. In the Silurian and Devonian, it was vegetation quietly inventing real estate, staking claims on riverbanks, shoring up coastlines, and expanding the very definition of land. Even the sediments changed character under the influence of plant matter. Organic, rich muds collected in sheltered pockets, dark and fertile compared to the mineral-dominated deposits of earlier ages. These new substrates held water longer and compacted differently, creating surfaces that interacted with tides in ways entirely new to Earth's history. The coastline began to behave more elastically, yielding gently to water rather than collapsing outright. By stabilizing the land, plants inadvertently stabilized the boundaries between land and sea. Estuaries were no longer just the pause before water entered the ocean. They were regions with their own shape, lifespan, and influence. They held water, they slowed it. They transformed the edges of continents into gradients of experience rather than lines of separation. And so, with every quiet root and every creeping leaf, plants reshaped the world's coasts, not by force, not by intention, but by the steady persistence of growth. The Silurian and Devonian continents gained not only greenery, but structure, and river mouths gained something they had rarely possessed before: the ability to stay a while. By the Devonian, rivers had carved steady paths across plant-stabilized landscapes, widening into coastal shallows that now lingered long enough to feel like actual places. These spreading river mouths were quiet mosaics of fresh water flowing outward and salty tides pushing gently inward. Into this world, still unfamiliar, still unsettled, came a group of explorers with scales, fins, and the dubious curiosity that often precedes evolutionary breakthroughs. Early fish. Most fish of the Devonian knew where they belonged. Some were devoted freshwater specialists, thriving in rivers and lakes where salinity remained predictable. Others inhabited the open ocean, satisfied with the consistent mineral content of marine water. Between these domains lay the brackish boundary, a chemically unstable middle ground fluctuating with each tide, storm, or seasonal change. For millions of years, few ventured into this transitional zone. But eventually, some fish, perhaps guided by a stray current, perhaps by a mistake in navigation, found themselves gliding into water that tasted slightly unfamiliar. Remarkably, they didn't immediately turn back. Brackish water offered a strange invitation. Its salt levels were diluted compared to the ocean, yet concentrated compared to fresh water. To early fish, whose bodies maintained delicate internal balances, this was a negotiation they were not initially qualified to conduct. Water entered or exited their tissues faster than was convenient. Gills worked overtime. Cells complained. Osmosis, acting as the uncompromising referee of all aquatic life, made sure that any fish lingering here would need to develop a strategy or retreat. But a few did not retreat. They lingered, adjusted, and endured. And in doing so, they unlocked new ecological real estate. The physiological demands of brackish living were steep. Marine fish entering low salinity zones found themselves absorbing more water than they wanted, forcing their kidneys to work like miniature desalination plants. Freshwater species entering saltier gradients experienced the reverse. They lost water rapidly and had to conserve every molecule with careful internal chemistry. Yet both types discovered something surprising. With the right adjustments in gill structure, ion pumps, and metabolic regulation, the discomfort could be managed. These early pioneers of salinity flexibility did not have a name for their emerging abilities, but modern biologists do. Osmoregulation. It became the passport that allowed fish to travel through territories once closed to them. The brackish zone, previously a chemical barrier, became a corridor of possibility. The estuaries of the Devonian were not like today's bustling nurseries of marine life. They were sparse, shifting landscapes of submerged roots, sediment fans, and dim waters muddied by the interplay of tides and river flow. but their very unpredictability made them valuable. Larger predators found the variable salinity uncomfortable and avoided these zones unless absolutely necessary. This left space, rare, precious space, for adaptable fish to experiment with new habits. Some species darted between freshwater and brackish zones in daily cycles, testing the limits of their tolerance. Others settled permanently in the intermediate waters, becoming specialists in an environment that discouraged specialization. Their diets shifted accordingly. Insects and worm-like invertebrates colonized the riverbanks and shallows, creating new opportunities for feeding. Small marine organisms swept in by tides offered additional meals. Brackish fish learned to exploit both, nibbling on anything slow or unfortunate enough to cross their path. Over time, gill structures in certain lineages became more versatile. Ion-transporting cells proliferated. Internal chemistries expanded their toolkit of responses. These modifications did not occur because the fish sought improvement. Adaptation is rarely so intentional, but because each tiny physiological shift helped its owner survive just a bit longer. Those who managed the balancing act between salt and fresh lived to contribute their genes to the next generation. Slowly, incrementally, estuarine tolerance spread into multiple fish groups. These transitional waters also shaped behavior. Fish that lived in brackish zones developed flexible movement patterns, drifting upstream during low salinity pulses and returning toward the coast when tides rose. Others formed loose aggregations near submerged vegetation, using the structurally complex environment for shelter. In rivers, fish often faced a single dominant flow. In estuaries, currents changed direction twice daily, encouraging species to develop improved spatial awareness and responsiveness. In a sense, brackish waters were training grounds, evolutionary classrooms, as it were, where the lessons were constant and the tests were pass/fail. To the developing ecosystems, these adaptable fish became essential intermediaries. They transported nutrients between freshwater and marine environments, cycling organic matter in ways that subtly shifted food webs. Their presence attracted new predators willing to flirt with salinity fluctuations, though not without reservations. Even the carcasses of these fish contributed to the chemical richness of the estuaries, adding organic material to sediments where other organisms, microbial or otherwise, could benefit. Brackish habitats expanded as coastlines stabilized further. Plants grew more confidently along the riverbanks, shaping sheltered coves and narrow channels. Tides sculpted the soft sediment into pools, beds, and branching waterways. Within these evolving landscapes, fish continued exploring, adapting, and inadvertently designing new ecological roles. They proved that surviving in an unstable environment required neither extreme toughness nor perfect specialization, just enough flexibility to avoid being undone by the daily confusion. In time, the descendants of these adventurous fish would diversify dramatically. Some would become masters of both worlds, traveling thousands of miles between river and sea. Others would settle permanently in brackish habitats, evolving into species whose tolerances were tuned precisely to variability itself. But in the Devonian, it all started with a few curious swimmers moving downstream, tasting the faint salt in the water, and deciding, for reasons evolution never bothers to explain, that it wasn't so bad. Fish, it turned out, could handle a little compromise. And brackish water, once a no-man's land of chemistry, became a stage for some of the earliest experiments in adaptability. By the late Paleozoic, estuaries had matured into broad, sheltered environments shaped by tides, rivers, and the persistent influence of shoreline vegetation. But physical structure alone does not define a habitat. A place becomes alive when organisms begin to move through it, manipulate it, and claim it. And for estuaries, that transformation began when mud, once considered merely the planet's catch-all for stray sediment, became something far more valuable: real estate for burrowers. The muds accumulating at river mouths were different from the coarser sediments upstream. Here, the combination of slowed currents, organic material, and fine mineral grains produced a texture unlike anything the oceans had seen before. Soft, oxygen-poor, nutrient-laden, and wonderfully malleable. To some creatures, these muddy flats looked uninviting, unstable, shifting, and prone to trapping the careless. But to others, particularly the early burrowing animals, the softness was not a hazard, but an invitation. Invertebrates were among the first tenants. Small worms, arthropods, and mollusks explored the sediment, driven by the promise of food hidden just beneath the surface. Organic debris accumulated in the mud as plants along riverbanks shed leaves, stems, and other materials that journeyed downstream before settling into estuarine beds. Microbial communities had also taken hold here, thriving in the chemical gradients that developed as oxygen dwindled with depth. This made the mud a buffet, one that rewarded those willing to venture downward. Burrowers approached cautiously at first, carving tentative grooves in the upper layers of sediment. But soon, they dug deeper, carving tunnels and chambers that transformed the estuary floors into bustling, subterranean neighborhoods. These animals did not coordinate with one another, yet collectively they reshaped the environment. Their movements oxygenated some layers of mud, mixed others, and allowed buried nutrients to reach the surface again. By disturbing the sediment, they created structure where there had once been only stillness. Many of these early bioturbators were modest in size, no larger than a fingertip, but their impact was vast. Their tunnels changed how water moved through the sediment, allowing tides to flush deeper layers and increasing the mobility of certain minerals. Nutrients that would otherwise remain locked away became available to the organisms living above. The mud, previously just a resting place for drifting particles, became an active zone of chemical and biological processing. As burrowers expanded their influence, predators took notice. Some fish and arthropods began poking at the mud, probing for the small morsels hiding below. Their foraging behavior added another dimension to estuarine complexity, turning the surface into a dynamic arena where movement above and below intertwined. Even the slightest disturbance, a shadow passing overhead, a ripple from a tide, could send tiny creatures retreating into their burrows or emerging cautiously in search of food. This new vertical dimension fundamentally altered the estuary. No longer was it a world defined primarily by horizontal flow, fresh water moving seaward, tides moving landward. Now life operated in layers. The muddy bed, once the quiet endpoint of sediment transport, became a habitat layered with micro-ecosystems. The upper millimeters hosted oxygen-tolerant microbes and grazing invertebrates. Deeper zones became home to anaerobic bacteria, decomposing organic material with slow precision. Other organisms carved spaces in between, navigating gradients of light, chemistry, and safety. The geology of estuaries shifted as well. Repeated burrowing loosened some sediments while compacting others. Pockets of gas formed in the deeper layers, the byproducts of microbial metabolism. Tunnels collapsed and reformed, creating a sedimentary record more patchwork than stratified. To a geologist hundreds of millions of years later, these disrupted layers would reveal unmistakable signatures of early life stirring the mud long before forests colonized the land or reptiles dominated the coasts. Some burrowers became specialists of particular depths. Shallow digging crustaceans combed the upper sediments, filtering particles or scraping microbial films. Worm-like creatures ventured deeper, tunneling in slow spirals or weaving intricate mazes. Mollusks, some equipped with muscular feet perfect for shoveling, pushed into the mud and anchored themselves, siphoning water for nutrients while remaining safely concealed. Each repeated movement added texture to a once featureless landscape. Over time, entire communities organized themselves around these muddy foundations. Soft-bottom estuarine habitats supported more species than their earlier counterparts, not because conditions were easier, but because the mud offered options. It allowed creatures to hide, feed, rest, escape, and sometimes ambush. It created gradients, oxygen here, sulfides there, organic enrichment in pockets, and gradients created niches. Niche creation, evolution's favorite pastime, accelerated. The mud's chemistry also started to influence the overlying water. Burrowers ventilated their tunnels, enabling oxygen to travel deeper and allowing reduced compounds to escape upward. These exchanges subtly modified the estuary's nutrient cycles. Phosphorus and nitrogen, once locked within sediments, became available in pulses. Microbial mats in adjacent zones responded, growing in tandem with these nutrient releases. In this way, the mud connected the visible world above with an unseen world below, each influencing the other in a gentle but persistent rhythm. And as for the mud itself, well, after billions of years spent simply catching whatever the rivers delivered, it finally played a starring role. Soft-bottom habitats became refuges, feeding grounds, and engineering hubs for countless small organisms. The mud learned to welcome its inhabitants, shaping itself around their movements, firming where they pressed and loosening where they pushed. If mud could experience pride, this era might have been its moment, finally appreciated not merely as sediment, but as ecosystem. By the end of the late Paleozoic, estuaries had become complex environments shaped by upward and downward motion as much as by tides and rivers. The ground beneath the water had awakened, stirred by creatures exploring the depths of a place once defined only by its surface. Mud, humble and overlooked, had found its purpose. A foundation that supported life not by holding still, but by allowing itself to be reshaped again and again. By the late Paleozoic, Earth had grown accustomed to cycles, day and night, seasons, tides, the rise and fall of continents. But nothing reshaped coastlines quite like the expanding and retreating ice sheets that began to dominate the planet's rhythms. Glacial pulses arrived with slow, deliberate force, sculpting landscapes with the patience of a mountain and the persistence of a tide that refused to accept the limits of shoreline. When ice accumulated, water was locked away on land, lowering sea levels globally. Coastlines retreated, exposing wide tracts of continental shelf that had spent millions of years underwater. Valleys deepened as rivers cut farther and farther seaward, chasing the receding ocean. Some river mouths shifted by hundreds of kilometers, carving new channels through exposed sediments that had never before felt the sun. Estuaries vanished as the land extended outward, their sheltered waters replaced by windswept plains, braided streams, and deltas eager to expand into the temporary emptiness. But these low-sea intervals were never permanent. Eventually, the ice would weaken, temperatures rose, glaciers melted, and the oceans, patient, massive, and incapable of resisting gravity, returned to reclaim the land. Sea levels surged upward, drowning the freshly carved valleys and swallowing the new river courses. What had been broad floodplains became submerged with startling efficiency. What had been rivers became fjords, deep and angular, their walls freshly scraped by glacial weight. Buried within this constant reshaping was a curious truth. Estuaries never quite died. They simply shifted. They withdrew when the seas fell, migrated with the flowing rivers, and returned when the tides were given new room to rise. They adapted to the coastline's rearrangements with an almost philosophical acceptance, as though understanding that permanence was never part of the deal. Where there was a river meeting rising water, an estuary would appear. Perhaps not in the same place, perhaps not with the same contours, but undeniably present. These cycles of exposure and inundation created landscapes of unusual complexity. During glacial lows, rivers carved deep canyons in the continental shelf, their energy amplified by steeper gradients. Some sections became so deeply incised that when the seas rose again, they formed long, narrow estuaries stretching far inland. These drowned river valleys, bordered by high cliffs, offered new environments for life, sunlit near the surface, shadowed in steep-walled depths, and threaded with layers of salinity that shifted with each incoming tide. Other regions experienced gentler transitions, where sediments accumulated during glacial lows. Rising seas later formed sprawling estuarine plains. These shallow, gently sloping areas encouraged branching channels, tidal flats, and labyrinthine networks of waterways. Each cycle layered new sediments upon old ones, creating a patchwork of mineral histories written into the ground. The coastlines refused stillness, but they left clues behind. Buried riverbeds, ancient shorelines, and submerged terraces that would one day reveal their stories to those patient enough to look. For the organisms living within these shifting worlds, stability became a luxury they could not rely upon. Plants that once anchored riverbanks found themselves submerged. Mud-dwelling creatures were occasionally stranded on newly exposed plains, their former habitats now perched above sea level. Fish that had adapted to particular salinity gradients discovered that their estuary had migrated miles away. In such a restless environment, success belonged not to the most finely tuned specialists, but to the generalists, those capable of adjusting quickly, wandering freely, or enduring long absences until familiar conditions returned. Some species took advantage of these shifts. When seas rose, marine organisms invaded the newly flooded valleys, discovering habitats rich in nutrients delivered by rivers. When seas fell, freshwater species expanded downstream, colonizing channels that had once been saline. With each glacial cycle, organisms moved back and forth like travelers following a migrating border. Many lineages survived not through mastery, but through memory, returning to old patterns when the world restored them, as if nature were flipping through a recurring set of geological pages. The sediments within estuaries revealed this story with remarkable clarity. Layers alternated between terrestrial deposits formed during low seas and marine silts laid down during high seas. Some sequences recorded dozens of transitions, each one a testament to coastlines refusing to adopt a single identity. The muds, sands, and gravels stacked like chapters in a book that never quite reached its final version. The rivers themselves responded dramatically to the glacial rhythms. During low seas, they lengthened and deepened, their mouths extending far across what had once been ocean floor. When sea levels rose, the drowned valleys caused the rivers to slow abruptly, dropping their sediments in thick wedges at the base of the newly formed estuaries. Over time, these deposits created underwater deltas that continued to adjust with every tidal cycle, contributing yet another layer to the ever-changing coastal architecture. Tectonics occasionally added its own commentary to the ice-driven reshaping. Uplift in some regions countered rising seas, creating unexpected refuges for certain estuarine organisms. Subsidence in others amplified the drowning effect, accelerating the formation of deep embayments. Yet even these large-scale geological processes were overshadowed by the relentless tempo of glacial advance and retreat. In such an unpredictable world, estuaries became experts in impermanence. They learned to appear wherever rivers and seas converged under shifting conditions. They learned to disappear without ceremony and return without apology. They learned that their identity was not tied to location or shape or even longevity, but to the simple fact that somewhere, always, fresh water met salt. And so, through the late Paleozoic and into the early Mesozoic, the coastlines danced, retreated, advanced, and reformed. Estuaries followed along, resilient and adaptable, demonstrating that even in a world where nothing stayed still, life could find patterns worth repeating. Coastlines may have refused to settle, but estuaries, ever patient, simply waited for the next convergence, ready to begin again. By the Mesozoic, the world pulsed with reptilian ambition. From small, fleet-footed forms darting across fern-covered floodplains to immense giants shaking the ground with each step, reptiles had made themselves at home in nearly every terrestrial environment. Yet amid all this expansion, an unexpected frontier drew their attention. The quiet, shifting boundaries where rivers surrendered their fresh water to the incoming breath of the sea. Estuaries, ever adaptable, ever opportunistic, had become landscapes worth watching. These margins were unlike the open plains or dense forests inland. They were neither wholly aquatic nor convincingly terrestrial. They changed by the hour, swelling with the tides, draining with the ebb, reshaping their channels with each season's flood. But to reptiles whose lives straddled warmth and mobility, these brackish borderlands offered something irresistible: abundance. Here, small fish schooled in predictable patterns, crustaceans scuttled beneath soft mud, insects hovered above still pools, and young prey species gathered in sheltered nooks carved by the tides. The estuary had become a storehouse of edible possibilities. Some reptiles visited casually, dipping in for a meal and retreating to drier ground. Others lingered, discovering that the estuarine margins offered more than food. They offered warmth. The Mesozoic sun, filtering across wide tidal flats and shallow creeks, heated the silty banks with remarkable efficiency. Reptiles warmed themselves here like sunbathers who had stumbled upon a thermal spa, absorbing energy before slipping back into the water or onto firmer soils. The interplay of sunlight, sediment, and shallow water created microclimates far more stable than the shifting sands farther inland. Aquatic reptiles, too, found promise in these transitional zones. The early relatives of crocodilians glided through brackish channels with surprising elegance, their bodies already well suited to ambush tactics. Estuaries gave them precisely the stage they preferred: murky waters for concealment, narrow inlets that funneled prey, and a gentle gradient between river and sea that let them roam widely without committing to a single habitat. These hunters were adaptable, but here they were also comfortable. Yet predation was only part of the story unfolding along the river mouths. Estuaries had become nurseries, safer, calmer waters shielded from the chaos of open seas and the unpredictability of inland floods. Many fish species used the diluted salinity as a cradle, their juveniles sheltering in vegetation-lined pools and muddy backwaters. This created a reliable food web that reptiles, whether intentionally or not, benefited from. A hungry reptile wandering the shoreline didn't need to search far. The tides delivered meals gently, like a conveyor belt operated by the moon. The vegetation along estuarine margins shifted as well, adapting to the brackish rhythms. Sturdy shrubs and early salt-tolerant plants took root in higher zones, stabilizing banks and creating shaded refuges. Their presence provided cover for small reptiles escaping predators and offered nesting areas for species that preferred damp but elevated terrain. Eggs laid in these transitional spaces enjoyed buffered temperatures and minimal disturbance, protected by both the vegetation and the landscape's layered gradients. Reptilian footprints left in soft mud tell much of this story. Some show careful, deliberate steps, animals wading slowly at low tide, scanning the shifting water for movement. Others indicate rapid bursts of speed, likely from predators lunging at passing prey, or from herbivores startled by a sudden splash. A few prints even suggest that young reptiles practiced swimming or shoreline foraging, the estuary serving as a training ground for skills they would need as adults. The diversity of reptilian visitors expanded as the Mesozoic progressed. Marine reptiles approached the upper reaches of estuaries during high tide, their sleek forms sliding into calmer waters where prey was plentiful and currents gentler. Semi-aquatic species ventured between land and water as though testing lifestyle options, while terrestrial reptiles navigated the margins in search of eggs, insects, or simply a stable patch of sunlight. The landscape became a convergence zone, a place where creatures with vastly different body plans and ecological goals briefly shared the same mosaic of mudflats, channels, and sunlit banks. And despite this crowdedness, the estuary rarely became chaotic. Each species carved its own routine around the pulsing rhythms of the water. Crocodilian ancestors haunted deeper pools. Small reptiles scuttled along exposed flats moments after the tide receded. Larger herbivores arrived only during the driest hours, when the mud had stiffened enough to support their weight. The result was an odd but effective choreography, a kind of unspoken agreement that the shoreline belonged to everyone so long as no one tried to define ownership too firmly. This coexistence came with evolutionary consequences. Reptiles that frequented estuaries developed keen sensitivity to water levels, temperature shifts, and subtle salinity changes. Some evolved more tolerant skin or more efficient kidneys to handle occasional salt intake. Others refined their hunting strategies, learning to anticipate tidal movements that concentrated prey. Estuaries, with their perpetual flux, acted as training grounds, not just for fish, as in previous chapters, but now for reptiles adapting to a world that rewarded flexibility. Even as sea levels rose and fell throughout the Mesozoic, the bond between reptiles and river mouths persisted. Each time the coastline shifted, reptiles reappeared, drawn by the same fundamentals: warmth, food, shelter, and opportunity. Estuaries were not permanent places, but they were consistent in their promise. Wherever the river met the sea, reptiles followed. By the end of the Mesozoic, these boundaries between land and water had become some of the most vibrant reptilian crossroads on Earth. Predators hunted, juveniles learned, communities overlapped, and life moved through the margins with a mingled sense of competition and cooperation. And though no creature ever claimed ownership, the shoreline thrived precisely because it was shared, a living testament to the advantages of mutual ambiguity in a world that rarely stood still. By the Cretaceous, Earth's landscapes were undergoing a botanical revolution so subtle in its beginnings that no creature alive at the time could have recognized its significance. Flowering plants, angiosperms, were taking root with quiet determination, weaving themselves into ecosystems that had never before experienced such botanical ingenuity. They arrived not as conquerors, but as opportunists, settling beside rivers where moisture was reliable and sunlight abundant. And in doing so, they transformed the mechanics of estuaries with the gentle persistence of organisms that had perfected the art of staying put. To earlier plants, riverbanks were simply moist real estate. But angiosperms saw opportunity. Their roots grew dense and fine, branching into tangled meshes that gripped soil with a precision unmatched by the ancient ferns and gymnosperms around them. Where older plants had merely coexisted with erosion, angiosperms actively negotiated with it, capturing sediments, gathering organic material, and storing it like the world's most patient gardeners. Each rain event that once scoured riverbanks now contributed to building them instead. Sediment stuck, collected, and accumulated, creating stable platforms that expanded bit by bit into the flow. This rooting behavior changed everything about how rivers reached the sea. The once frequent collapses of riverbanks diminished, replaced by curves, meanders, and shaded alcoves that guided water more gently. As angiosperms multiplied along these margins, their roots locked sediments in place with such efficiency that rivers slowed upon approach to the ocean, spreading into wider networks of channels before delivering their diluted fresh water into brackish zones. The estuaries of the Cretaceous began to broaden, not from sudden geological uplift or catastrophic flooding, but from the day-by-day influence of plants that simply refused to let soil wander. With slower flow came calmer waters. Sediments that once rushed seaward now drifted lazily, settling in soft layers across expanding estuarine flats. Fine particles mingled with organic debris, fallen petals, decomposing leaves, bits of root, and formed nutrient-rich muds that became the quiet engine of productivity. Wherever these deposits lingered, microbial life flourished, feeding on the buffet of carbon compounds delivered by the flowering forests upstream. These microbes, in turn, enriched the water for larger organisms, setting off a slow but unmistakable chain reaction of abundance. Angiosperms also cast shade in ways earlier plants rarely managed. Their broad leaves arched over river margins, filtering sunlight into scattered patterns that cooled the shallows and encouraged diverse microhabitats. Some species dropped blossoms into the water, where petals drifted like tiny rafts before decomposing into additional nutrients. Others extended roots not merely into soil but directly into the water, creating intricate tangles that served as shelters for young fish, crustaceans, and the small invertebrates that fed on leaf litter. The estuary became a cradle for new interactions. Juvenile fish wove through root networks like children exploring an underwater playground. Tiny crustaceans clung to submerged stems, scraping algae and detritus off their surfaces. Insects danced along the water's edge, drawn by pollen drifting in gentle clouds. Larger animals arrived in turn, following the promise of easy meals offered by sheltered breeding grounds and nutrient-rich shallows. The effect was subtle, dispersed, and persistent. Productivity blossomed not in dramatic bursts, but with the steady assurance of a garden that tended itself. Meanwhile, sedimentation patterns shifted in ways that fundamentally rewrote estuarine geography. As angiosperms trapped and stabilized soils, deltas expanded outward. Shallow bays filled gradually, their depths yielding to sedges, reeds, and flowering plants that tolerated occasional flooding. Channels multiplied, splitting, rejoining, braiding across new land formed grain by grain. The estuary stopped behaving like a narrow boundary and began behaving like a mosaic, a patchwork of water and earth shaped not by tides alone, but by the cumulative stubbornness of plants anchoring every available surface. This mosaic grew more chemically complex as well. Angiosperms contributed organic acids to the soil, subtly altering the mineral composition of sediments. Their decaying tissues enriched muds with nutrients that fueled dense growths of plankton and benthic organisms. The resulting blooms, while not the explosive kind often associated with later human activity, nonetheless increased oxygen exchanges and supported layered food webs. The estuary became a place where chemical gradients sharpened and diversified, a quiet experiment in ecological layering conducted by roots and leaves. Some flowering plants even ventured into salinity-tolerant adaptations, making cautious forays into the brackish zone itself. These early salt-tolerant angiosperms did not form vast marshes yet, but they hinted at future innovations. They anchored shorelines that shifted with every tide, adding further stability to environments once scoured by daily flooding. With their arrival, the estuary gained new textures, stands of vegetation that softened waves, slowed currents, and trapped yet more sediment in a self-reinforcing loop. This feedback mechanism, plants slowing water, water depositing sediments, sediments enabling more plants, became a quiet revolution. It thickened deltas, it expanded wetlands, it turned once transient environments into lasting structures. Estuaries that had spent millions of years moving restlessly with each climatic shift now lingered longer, resisting erosion with botanical determination. It was a rare moment when evolution, hydrology, and geology shook hands, agreeing, perhaps only temporarily, on the shape of the land. The creatures living through this transformation may not have understood its cause, but they certainly appreciated its results. Herbivorous dinosaurs visited river mouths lined with flowering shrubs, feeding on lush vegetation before retreating inland. Small mammals scurried along the banks, using dense plant cover as protection. Even predatory reptiles took advantage of the calmer waters, stalking prey that gathered in sheltered pools and channels. The edges of the estuary grew busy but harmonious, each species finding its rhythm amid the flowers and silt. And through it all, angiosperms simply continued growing, quietly, persistently, inventing ecological infrastructure without the faintest ambition. Their roots held the land, their leaves fed the water, their blossoms scattered nutrients like confetti tossed at a celebration no one had explicitly planned. The estuary, shaped by countless planetary forces before them, now carried the unmistakable signature of flowering plants. Stability born from softness, abundance from patience, structure from simple insistence. In the Cretaceous, the estuary became not just a boundary, but a blooming, layered, gently humming system. And all because flowers, without meaning to, became the engineers of its flow. By the late Mesozoic, the world had grown busy with footsteps, splashes, and rustles, but the arrival of wings added a new dimension of movement. Birds, descended from agile theropods with a flair for feathers, lifted themselves above the landscapes their ancestors once strode across. For the first time, life could look down on an estuary rather than simply arrive at its margins. And from this new vantage point, the winding channels, shimmering shallows, and mosaics of plant-lined banks offered something irresistible: predictability. Estuaries had always been places defined by flux. Tides rolled in and out, sediments shifted, salinity fluctuated with seasons and storms. But for birds surveying the terrain from above, these shifting zones presented a consistent logic. Water pooled reliably in certain places. Mudflats exposed themselves at regular intervals, revealing buffet-like spreads of small crustaceans and fish. Vegetation flourished predictably along calmer edges, providing shelter, nesting opportunities, and insect prey. For creatures learning to navigate vast distances, such consistency was not just useful, it was essential. Early birds were not the long-distance migrants their later relatives would become, but they were quick learners. Their new mobility allowed them to link landscapes that had previously existed in ecological isolation. A river mouth that provided food in one season could be revisited months later, even if separated by mountain ranges, dense forests, or shifting coastlines. Estuaries became reference points, geographical bookmarks in the growing mental maps of feathered travelers. Some birds used estuaries as rest stops, places to pause between journeys or expansions of territory. They perched on driftwood or sandbars, preening salt from their feathers while scanning the shallows for movement. These resting birds left small traces, feathers caught in reeds, footprints pressed into mud, that told stories of brief but repeated visits. Over time, such visits became habits, and habits began shaping migration patterns. Other birds discovered estuaries as feeding grounds unmatched by the inland habitats they frequented. Shallow waters teemed with juvenile fish, insects, small amphibians, and countless invertebrates living in the mud. Birds waded, probed, dipped, and plunged. Long-beaked species swept the flats with delicate precision, teasing worms and crustaceans from beneath the surface. Shorter-legged birds hovered and darted over pools, snatching insects in quick bursts. Larger aquatic birds, their wingspans wide enough to cast brief shadows across the channel, dived after fish navigating the calm, brackish waters. Each found nourishment in abundance. The birds were not merely visitors, they were participants. As they fed, rested, and occasionally nested along these margins, they transported nutrients between ecosystems. Droppings enriched estuarine soils, adding organic material to an environment already rich from the contributions of plants and riverborne sediments. Feathers and bone fragments became part of the detritus that fueled decomposer communities. Even the predators following birds, terrestrial or aquatic, became inadvertent agents in redistributing energy across the system. Some birds developed seasonal rhythms anchored to these reliable zones. During warm periods, estuaries brimmed with vegetation and prey, drawing flocks that congregated in loose, shifting assemblies. During cooler seasons, Ice or storms might drive them inland temporarily, but they returned as soon as conditions stabilized. This predictability helped shape early migratory behavior, not yet spanning continents, but stretching between regions in a manner both opportunistic and increasingly patterned. Estuaries offered something else birds found unexpectedly useful: stability amid chaos. The late Mesozoic was a time of dynamic climates, volcanic disruptions, continental rearrangements, and biological competition. Forests expanded and retreated, inland lakes appeared and vanished, and mountain ranges rose to alter rainfall patterns. Yet estuaries, anchored by the perennial certainty of rivers meeting the sea, remained dependable. They shifted position and shape, yes, but their essential nature persisted. No matter how the world reorganized itself, water would always flow downhill, and the sea would always rise to meet it. For birds managing territory and resource needs across large distances, this was a rare and priceless constant. Some species even evolved structural adaptations that made the most of estuarine opportunities. Long legs for wading, curved beaks for probing mud, webbed feet for navigating the mix of land and water, wing shapes that balanced gliding and maneuvering over open flats. The estuary became not just a destination, but a shaping force, a teacher guiding the evolution of forms suited to harvesting its quiet abundance. Vegetation played a supporting role in these aerial developments. Flowering plants, already reshaping riverbanks and sediment flow, now offered additional food sources. Birds sampled nectar, fed on seeds, or hunted insects drawn to the blooms. In return, the birds dispersed pollen or carried seeds to new locations along the coastline, helping angiosperms extend their reach. This mutual reinforcement expanded the plant-lined margins of estuaries, creating more nesting pockets and shaded areas where birds could find shelter from predators or weather. As birds multiplied in diversity and number, estuaries became animated with their presence. Dawn brought a chorus of calls echoing across mudflats. Midday saw sweeping shadows as flocks took flight. Evening offered silhouettes perched quietly among reeds, watching the tides shift one last time before nightfall. From above, the estuary likely seemed a shimmering puzzle of blues, greens, and browns. From within, it felt like a crossroads where many journeys met for a moment before scattering again. And all of this happened without deliberate promotion. Estuaries did not advertise their amenities. They simply existed, broad, layered, predictable in their unpredictability. Birds discovered them through instinct, curiosity, and the occasional fortunate detour. Yet once found, these places became essential threads in the tapestry of avian life. They appeared reliable even as the world changed around them, offering food, shelter, warmth, and orientation. In the late Mesozoic, wings stitched distant regions together, and estuaries became the seams where those threads overlapped. Quietly, inevitably, these once overlooked margins transformed into some of the most well-attended habitats on Earth, without ever once trying to stand out. With the dawn of the Cenozoic, Earth entered an era shaped not by scales or wings, but by fur and warm-blooded determination. Mammals, once modest creatures thriving in the shadows of dinosaurs, expanded into a spectacular range of forms. Forests, grasslands, mountains, and coasts all found themselves gradually claimed by creatures who nursed their young, listened with sensitive ears, and sniffed their way through a world of shifting opportunity. And inevitably, some of these early mammals wandered toward the estuaries, those broad, shimmering margins where certainty dissolved into gradients and adaptability was the only reliable compass. Estuaries in the Cenozoic were dynamic mosaics of mudflats, winding creeks, marshy thickets, and tidal pools that expanded and contracted daily. Earlier inhabitants, fish, reptiles, birds, had long since learned to navigate the instability. Mammals, with their insulated bodies and high-energy metabolisms, approached these environments with a different set of tools. Where reptiles relied on patience and birds on flight, mammals relied on curiosity. It was this curiosity that brought them to the water's edge, where the world smelled, sounded, and tasted unlike anything inland. The first mammalian visitors came cautiously. Small insectivores skittered along the margins, sniffing for crustaceans and beetles hiding in wet silt. Rodent-like creatures gnawed on roots and stems of marsh vegetation. Their tracks, tiny, uncertain, suggest hesitation, as if they expected the ground to vanish beneath them at any moment. And sometimes it did. Estuarine mud had a habit of welcoming visitors with more enthusiasm than intended. But mammals adapted quickly. Those that lingered near the shallows discovered the advantages of this unruly landscape. The mud, rich with organic matter, supported an invertebrate community that provided abundant food. Burrowing animals excavated tunnels in elevated banks where the soil was firmer, creating complex underground networks safe from fluctuating tides. Semi-aquatic species discovered that brackish waters housed fish and amphibians that moved slower than their open-sea counterparts, making them ideal prey for mammals that could swim, or at least paddle, well enough to give chase. The adaptations mammals displayed at the estuarine edge were not uniform. They were experiments performed one lineage at a time. Some species specialized in wading, evolving long limbs that allowed them to stride through knee-deep waters without sinking. Their toes spread wide, distributing weight over soft ground the way a snowshoe spreads weight over deep drifts. Others took to digging, carving dens into slightly elevated banks where roots and compacted sediments offered stability. These burrows became refuges from predators, heat, storms, and the occasional unexpected high tide. A few mammal groups did something remarkable. They embraced the water fully. Otter-like ancestors, sleek and agile, slipped into estuarine channels with increasing confidence. They learned to dive beneath the shimmering surface, to chase darting fish between reeds, and to float on their backs in calm bays while grooming their fur. Their bodies adapted with webbed feet, streamlined torsos, and dense coats that trapped warm pockets of air, perfect for creatures choosing to live where the water was cool and the weather unpredictable. Estuaries rewarded this willingness to get wet. These mammals found plentiful food and fewer competitors than inland ecosystems. Some herbivorous mammals also found their niche in the estuary's patchwork of moist vegetation. Browsers ventured near the brackish margins to feed on salt-tolerant plants that thrived in tidal zones. Grasses, sedges, and flowering plants provided a steady buffet that refreshed itself with every flood cycle. Large mammals used the open flats as rest areas, broad, treeless spaces where predators were easier to spot, and the sea breeze kept insects at bay. Their heavy footprints compressed the mud into patterned depressions, creating microhabitats for smaller organisms and subtly reshaping drainage patterns along the coast. The estuary's unpredictability demanded flexibility. Salinity shifted with every tide. Shorelines migrated with storms. Some food sources appeared in abundance one season and vanished the next. Mammals that succeeded here did not conform to strict dietary or behavioral expectations. They improvised. An animal that hunted fish at dawn might root for plant bulbs at low tide and dig for crabs in the afternoon. These mixed strategies were not signs of indecision. They were signs of ecological intelligence, the quiet wisdom of creatures adapting to a world that refused to settle. Predators soon followed their prey into the shallows. Early canids padded across mudflats, sniffing out burrows or startling shorebirds into frantic flight. Feline-like hunters stalked quietly through marsh grasses, using the rustle of reeds to conceal their approach. Even some large omnivores wandered down from inland forests, discovering that the estuary offered not only food, but mineral-rich water and cooling breezes. The edge between land and water became a meeting place of many strategies, each shaped by the need to exploit an environment with no fixed rules. One of the most profound contributions mammals made to estuarine ecosystems came through their movement of nutrients. By feeding in one area and defecating in another, they acted as carriers of organic matter across zones. Their dung nourished soils, their footprints churned mud, exposing buried layers. Their digging aerated sediments that would otherwise stagnate. Estuaries, already complex from earlier chapters in Earth's history, grew even richer with these new participants. Some mammals developed seasonal patterns around estuaries, much as birds had before them. When inland droughts tightened their hold, mammals moved toward the coast to take advantage of stable moisture and reliable plant growth. When storms flooded lowland habitats, the same mammals retreated to higher ground, but often returned as soon as the tides returned to rhythm. The estuary acted as an ecological buffer, less predictable than a forest, but more generous in its variety of refuge. And through all these shifts, mammals learned something essential about the estuarine world. It did not reward precision. It rewarded versatility. The creatures that thrived here were not the fastest runners, deepest divers, or most efficient grazers. They were the ones willing to swap roles, test behaviors, and trust that adaptability could outweigh specialization. In the Cenozoic, fur met humidity, curiosity met opportunity, and mammals met the estuary, an edge habitat that challenged them, changed them, and welcomed them back again and again. They entered cautiously and left transformed, having learned at long last to get their feet wet in more ways than one. By the late Cenozoic, The world's coastlines displayed a confidence they had long been refining. Gone were the chaotic eras when shifting sediments or glacial seas redefined river mouths every few geological heartbeats. Although sea levels still rose and fell, and storms still rearranged shallow channels, the overall pattern of modern estuaries had begun to crystallize. The earth, in a sense, had grown into its coastlines, and as rivers poured toward the sea, they found familiar landscapes waiting, broad, branching, layered with vegetation and organisms ready to seize every niche. After billions of years of improvisation, estuaries were finally beginning to resemble the ones we know. A defining feature of these newer estuaries was their ability to slow water. Rivers arrived energetic and sediment-heavy, eager to continue the journey they began in the mountains. But as they approached the coast, they encountered landscapes sculpted by plant communities and stabilized by countless cycles of deposition. Tides curled inward through narrow inlets, meeting river currents with gentle resistance. This meeting produced not chaos, but compromise. Water moved forward, but slower. Tides pushed inland, but cautiously. It was as if water itself, after eons of rushing, was learning to take a breath. Into this calm stepped the salt marshes. These grassy expanses unfurled across the upper reaches of estuaries, thriving in the fluctuating mix of fresh water and seawater. Salt marsh grasses anchored soil more effectively than many terrestrial plants. Their dense root networks trapped fine sediments, knitting mud and silt into cohesive platforms. As the tides flowed in and out, they deposited layer upon layer of new material, gradually elevating the marsh even as sea levels wavered. These were landscapes built by patience, where quiet cycles accumulated into vast plains. Salt marshes didn't just stabilize the coastline, they transformed it. Their stems created friction, slowing the incoming tides and encouraging nutrient-rich particles to settle. Their decaying tissues enriched the sediment with organic matter, fueling microbial communities that, in turn, fed small invertebrates. The marsh became a subtle but potent engine of productivity, producing tremendous biomass from simple sunlight and brackish water. Countless organisms, from snails to small mammals, found refuge within the maze of stems. To the south, across warmer latitudes, another set of coastal architects stepped onto the stage: mangroves. These trees, with their peculiar ability to tolerate salt water, colonized muddy shorelines with tangled roots that rose above the water like stilts. Mangrove roots formed miniature fortresses that blocked waves, trapped sediments, and created sheltered lagoons. Their branches offered perches for birds, shade for fish, and nesting sites for crabs bold enough to climb. Each tangle of roots became a living scaffold, supporting multiple layers of life in an environment where land and sea embraced rather than opposed one another. Mangroves performed a trick few plants dared attempt. They slowed water at multiple levels: at the surface with their branches, mid-water with their trunks, and below with their roots. In doing so, they expanded the coastline, building soil outward leaf by leaf, tide by tide. Over millennia, Mangrove forests knitted themselves into dense belts that protected inland habitats and created homes for some of the most complex communities of the Estuary world. Mudflats, too, became essential components of modern estuaries. These broad, open expanses formed where tides deposited fine sediments during calm waters. Exposed at low tide, they glimmered with life: worms, mollusks, microbial films, and crustaceans busily feeding on the organic bounty embedded within the mud. Birds, whose ancestors had discovered estuaries' conveniences back in the Mesozoic, now relied on these flats as dependable foraging grounds. At high tide, the flats vanished under shallow waves. At low tide, they emerged again, like theater stages set and reset twice daily. All these habitats, marshes, mangroves, mudflats, were variations on the same environmental theme: water being coaxed, persuaded, and occasionally tricked into slowing down. And once slowed, water became generous. It allowed sediments to accumulate, nutrients to settle, larvae to disperse gently, and species to establish homes without being swept away. This was estuarine engineering performed collaboratively by plants, tides, and the sediments themselves. Meanwhile, rivers delivered a steady supply of fresh water that fluctuated with seasons, storms, and changing climates. The mixing of fresh and salt water created salinity gradients that shaped communities with stunning precision. Some species clustered near the fresher zones, others preferred the saltier channels, and still others moved back and forth depending on the tide. These gradients encouraged biodiversity not by offering perfect conditions, but by offering many different kinds of imperfect ones. The late Cenozoic estuary also became a crossroads for increasingly mobile mammals and birds. Migratory species returned year after year to the same sheltered channels, using them as nurseries or winter refuges. Fish species timed their spawning cycles with tidal pulses, relying on calm pockets of water to protect their young. Crabs scuttled in and out of burrows timed with the moon's pull. Even the mud became more structured, its top layers oxygenated by burrowers, its deeper strata rich with anaerobic life-recycling nutrients in the shadows. And through it all, the landscape itself remained a student of subtlety. With each tide, each flood, each shift in sea level, estuaries adjusted, never rigid, always responsive. The balance of currents, the tug of the moon, the weight of sediments, and the tenacity of rooted plants came together to form coastlines that were stable only in their willingness to change. This was the beginning of what we now recognize as modern estuarine character. Resilience built from softness, structure built from sediment, complexity built from compromise. Waters that once rushed now paused, reluctantly perhaps, but meaningfully, long enough for life to make plans, raise young, establish routines, and build intricate partnerships. In the late Cenozoic, estuaries finally achieved their modern identity. Not boundaries, but living transitions. Places where the world slowed just enough for countless species to slip into the space between land and sea and call it home. The Pleistocene arrived with a rhythm unlike any other epoch, a long, slow percussion of advancing ice and warming interludes. It was an age defined not by static landscapes, but by shifting boundaries. And nowhere was this more evident than where rivers met the sea. Estuaries, those delicate in-between worlds, found themselves caught in the repeated inhale and exhale of climate oscillation. The planet cooled, and coastlines retreated. The planet warmed, and waters surged forward again. For thousands of generations, estuaries lived in a perpetual state of reconsideration. When glaciers advanced, they claimed water from the oceans as surely as if snatching it off a table. Sea levels fell, sometimes by more than 100 meters, unveiling vast plains beneath the estuarine shallows. Channels that had braided gracefully across broad wetlands were forced to deepen and lengthen, cutting new paths through exposed mud and sand. Rivers, sensing the retreat of the sea, carved their way downslope with sharpened determination. Estuaries, once expansive and layered with life, narrowed into slender funnels, each one tucked far below the former shoreline. The creatures that lived in these shifting waters responded in ways that mirrored the climate's rhythm. Fish accustomed to brackish habitats followed the receding salinity downstream, discovering that their estuary had grown leaner, concentrating life into tighter corridors. Birds adjusted their seasonal routines, navigating to new feeding grounds revealed by the receding waters. Mammals explored the exposed plains, grazing on vegetation that colonized freshly uncovered soils. Even the invertebrates burrowed deeper, tracking moisture downward as the water table fell. The estuary did not disappear. It simply transformed, stretching thin like a ribbon rather than vanishing altogether. Then, inevitably, the warmth returned. Glaciers retreated, shedding meltwater back into the oceans. In slow, patient surges, the sea crept inland again. Valleys carved during low sea intervals drowned one by one, becoming deep estuarine channels that bore little resemblance to their earlier selves. Where once there had been plains dotted with grazing herbivores, there were now turquoise embayments. Where a river had flowed freely, it now wove among submerged hills, pouring its fresh water into drowned forests and sculpted basins. Life scrambled to adjust once more. Some species thrived in this rising water world. Fish moved upstream into newly formed pools and inlets, taking advantage of habitats that appeared almost overnight in geological terms. Birds found sheltered bays where vast shoals of young fish congregated in warm shallows. Mammals discovered new marshlands forming at the margins of the expanded estuaries, places where reeds, sedges, and salt-tolerant shrubs established themselves with the quiet urgency of opportunistic pioneers. Still, the Pleistocene refused to offer stability for long. The climate cycled again. Ice thickened, then thinned. Winds shifted. Ocean temperatures fluctuated. With every glacial pulse, estuaries stretched or contracted, like lungs fulfilling an ancient planetary breath. These changes were rarely catastrophic. They were simply constant. And in this constancy of change, organisms discovered a new kind of evolutionary pressure, not toward specialization, but toward resilience. Species that thrived in these estuaries did so because they tolerated variation as a rule, not an exception. Fish that could handle shifts in salinity and temperature found themselves in favorable positions. Those capable of spawning in both riverine and estuarine zones proved especially successful. Invertebrates diversified into forms that could cling to muddy banks during exposure or burrow deep enough to survive inundation. Birds perfected the art of scouting for new shallows, revising migration routes when coastlines rearranged themselves. Even the plants, those patient anchors of estuarine margins, adapted by dispersing seeds widely, trusting that at least some would find purchase on whatever shoreline existed at the moment. During colder intervals, certain estuaries became compressed into narrow, winding channels bordered by frozen soils. Yet even here, life persisted. Microbial communities thrived beneath ice-covered waters. Fish moved slowly but deliberately through chilled, brackish layers. Small mammals foraged along the frost-hardened banks, leaving delicate prints that froze before the next tidal cycle erased them. These organisms were not thriving in abundance, but they were surviving. And in the Pleistocene, survival itself was an act of triumph. During warmer interglacials, however, estuaries blossomed in dramatic fashion. Rising seas transformed modest channels into wide lagoons. Marshes expanded. Mudflats sprawled across new expanses of shallow water. Mangroves returned in warm regions, re-establishing their tangled roots and leafy canopies. Productivity surged as sunlight bathed nutrient-rich shallows, attracting dense schools of fish, flocks of birds, and mammals eager to exploit the renewed coastal bounty. What made these Pleistocene estuaries distinct from their earlier forms was not their shape or size, both of which changed frequently, but their growing predictability as ecological reset points. Though each cycle erased old patterns, it reliably created similar conditions anew. Life developed not just adaptations for a specific estuary, but for the idea of an estuary, the concept of a shifting, productive boundary between land and sea. This reliance on adaptability rather than specialization shaped entire lineages. Some species retained behavioral plasticity, able to feed across wide salinity ranges or nest in differing habitats depending on what the climate allowed. Others developed seasonal migrations, synchronized with tide cycles or vegetation patterns rather than fixed landmarks. The Pleistocene, with its glacial heartbeat, rewarded those who could wait, watch, and adjust. The ecosystem itself learned to absorb change with a kind of ecological grace. When estuaries vanished, nutrients were redistributed inland or out to sea. When estuaries returned, they rebuilt food webs with startling speed. Productivity did not vanish, it relocated. Life did not collapse, it rerouted. And each cycle deepened the estuary's identity as a place where flexibility was not merely beneficial, it was essential. As the Pleistocene moved toward its final warming phase, with glaciers withdrawing for what may be the last time in millions of years, estuaries once again expanded into familiar forms. Mudflats, marshes, and mangroves reappeared. Rivers widened their mouths and re-established graceful curves, and life, ever patient, reclaimed the edges. In the end, the Pleistocene's estuaries taught a quiet but profound lesson. Survival is not always about winning against change. It is about not insisting the world remain still. Evolution, in its understated wisdom, rewarded patience over perfection. In the near-present world, where the continents have settled into familiar outlines, and the climate pulses with rhythms both ancient and newly disturbed, estuaries persist as some of Earth's most quietly ingenious creations. They are not grand in the way mountains are grand, nor ancient in the way deserts remember deep time, nor vast like the open ocean whose horizons dissolve into sky. Instead, estuaries are subtle achievements, places where water slows, life gathers, and the planet practices the art of transition. They are not the result of a single evolutionary leap, but of many small negotiations made over hundreds of millions of years. Standing at the mouth of a modern river, one can sense immediately that this landscape is mid-sentence. The shoreline curves, but never quite resolves. Channels braid, split, and rejoin as if revising themselves. The water shifts color with each tide, blending minerals, sediments, and organic particles into a diluted palette that speaks of upstream forests, inland soils, and distant seas. Modern estuaries are never quite finished, and that is precisely why they work. Rivers arrive with stories carried from far inland, eroded minerals, dissolved nutrients, organic fragments from decaying leaves, and the occasional wanderer, small larvae or seeds drifting toward unfamiliar horizons. The sea greets these arrivals with its own vocabulary: salt, waves, tides, and the steady rhythms of lunar pull. Where these two waters meet, neither dominates. Instead, they translate. Fresh water softens salt water's edge. Salt water adds weight and structure to fresh water's flow. The estuary becomes an interpreter, ensuring both worlds can coexist without demanding complete compromise. That interpretive function is more impressive than it first appears. Modern estuaries filter sediments with the efficiency of practiced artisans, capturing whatever rivers deliver and laying it gently into layers shaped by currents and roots. They neutralize excess nutrients, absorbing what they can and releasing the rest in diluted pulses that sustain planktonic growth offshore. They trap pollutants too, though this is a burden evolution never intended for them to bear. Still, they manage, up to a point, with the quiet endurance that defines their history. Life in these estuaries is equally adept at translation. Fish species move in and out with the tide, some using the brackish waters as nurseries where predators are limited and food is abundant. Crabs and shrimp navigate mud and water with equal confidence, emerging to feed when conditions suit them and burying themselves when they do not. Birds arrive in rhythmic migrations, timing their journeys to coincide with the reliable nourishment found on exposed flats. Mammals explore the marsh fringes for roots, shoots, or smaller prey. And beneath the surface, countless microorganisms digest, cycle, and rebuild the chemical scaffolding that sustains the entire system. What makes this near-present version of the estuary remarkable is its dynamic equilibrium. Everything is in motion, yet everything fits. Sediments accumulate, but not endlessly. Channels shift, but rarely catastrophically. Species come and go with seasonal predictability. Yet each year, the estuary feels like a familiar place. It is an ecosystem built not on stasis, but on continuous recalibration. Vegetation plays a quiet but essential role in maintaining this balance. Salt marsh grasses bend with tides, absorbing the push and pull without breaking. Mangroves, where climates permit, anchor themselves with roots engineered to both breathe and stabilize. These plants slow the water just enough for suspended materials to settle, creating sheltered pockets where juvenile fish grow and invertebrate communities flourish. They build land grain by grain, but never in excess. They know better than to challenge the sea's eventual return. In some regions, estuaries form wide deltas, fans of sediment expanding slowly into the ocean, supported by vegetation that catches each new layer. In others, they carve narrow inlets bordered by cliffs or rolling dunes, places where tides funnel through with crisp, focused energy. Each estuary reflects its geology, climate, and biological history, yet all share the same foundational logic: that neutrality can be productive, that edges can be fertile, and that unfinished boundaries can host extraordinary abundance. Modern estuaries also serve as memory keepers. Their sediments record floods, droughts, storms, and ecological shifts in thin, delicate strata. A particularly wet decade leaves thicker deposits. A drought leaves pale layers of wind-blown dust. Even chemical signatures, pollen grains, isotopes, microscopic shells, capture the presence of species long gone or the arrival of new ones. To read an estuary's sediment core is to flip through a book describing a world in constant negotiation with itself. Yet despite their quiet genius, estuaries remain vulnerable. Their fluid identities depend on freedom to shift, something modern human activities often constrain. Dams reduce sediment flow. Coastal development straightens or walls off channels. Pollution overwhelms the natural filtering capacity honed across eons. These pressures challenge estuarine resilience not by breaking it outright, but by freezing it into forms too rigid for a system built on flexibility. Still, even under strain, estuaries display a remarkable willingness to continue functioning. They resist collapse by accommodating new variables, redistributing sediments, adjusting salinity gradients, and supporting whatever life can adapt to altered conditions. Their patience is vast, but not infinite. Yet it is deep enough to remind us that these environments evolve to absorb change, provided the pace allows for recalibration. In this near-present moment, we can appreciate the estuary not as a perfected system, but as a wise one. It is the peaceful mediator between river and sea, balancing forces that would otherwise clash. It is the nursery for countless species, the filter for continental runoff, the buffer for storms. It is unfinished because it must remain so. Completion would be stagnation, and stagnation would be the end of everything that makes an estuary what it is. Nature, in its typical understated humor, refuses to finalize the design, and in that refusal lies the brilliance of river mouths. They thrive precisely because they are always becoming, never fixed, always translating, forever adjusting to the shifting conversation between land and sea.